Now, last week, we just at the end of the programme gotten into a debate for the, there are those that want to see cannabis in various forms, decriminalised or reformed. And Peter Reynolds was talking to us, and Peter's back this week. So, Peter, thank you for coming back on the show. And Dave was here as well, and Dave was a former drugs officer with the police. Hello, Dave.
Hi, Tom. Good morning.
Right, if we can just pick up where we had to end it last week because the news caught up with us, and we didn't really get stuck into it. Peter, just to recap on your position as far as cannabis is concerned. You're not actually wanting a complete decriminalisation of it, are you?
Well, I think the key thing to say is, it's about terminology, but the key thing to say is that what we advocate is a cannabis market in which we have some proper control over the drug itself and people who have access to it, because we have neither of those things at the moment.
Yeah. Dave, you disagree, and my question to you is, if it is controlled, like Peter would like to see, is that not better for society?
Yeah, I suppose the context of the question, if it was controlled, could it be better for society? The answer to that is possibly yes, but there's no realistic way you can control it. For example, let's take alcohol, which we know is the biggest social drug in the UK. Kids that want to buy alcohol don't walk in the shop at 14 or 15-year-old because they know they're not going to get served.
Yeah.
And it would be exactly the same if you went along the lines of having these so-called cannabis cafes like we've got in Amsterdam, where you can go and purchase and use your cannabis within the premises.
Yeah.
All it'll do is they'll send in older people to buy the drugs for them. So all you're going to do is escalate the amount of cannabis that's actually available to young people. And what I'm trying to say is that the links with cannabis use to mental health issues, depression, schizophrenia, and all those, it's a well-proven argument. It's been going on for years and years and years, and I didn't really want to get into a debate with Peter about stats and figures, because I could throw figures at Peter, and I'm sure he could throw figures at me in relation to, the impact cannabis can have, whether it's addictive, what it does do to you, what mental health problems can come from, etc. But I look at this from two angles. Somebody that's spent possibly in the region now of nearly 30 years of being around people using drugs, quite a lot of those years in law enforcement as a drug squad officer, but a lot of years, certainly the last 12 years, providing drugs education, not only to youngsters but to parents and communities and other things. I've got first-hand experience of what this drug can do, and hence my sort of views really on about legalising. The reality is, if we had a facility in place where people could go and purchase cannabis legally, it would cause a nightmare, because they'd get round it, kids would access it via the means that I've already explained, and all we would do is just escalate the use, the promotion of cannabis, and make life a lot easier for those that want to use it. All the arguments about what damage it does, I think, have been exhausted.
Yeah.
Even if we just look recently at the live cannabis trial that Jon Snow hosted just recently. And they had a guy on there called Professor Nutt, I'm sure Peter Reynolds will know very well, who used to be one of the advisors for the government on drugs classification and other things.
This is the guy that got fired?
Yeah, he was sacked because he came out with a statement saying basically riding a horse is more dangerous than using ecstasy. Well, I rest my case on that, and I don't want to go down the line on that one. But, if we go down the route and follow that, and if you look at that, what that programme actually did, even Professor Nutt had to hold his hand up and said, yes, there's a direct link with particularly skunk, which is the potent form of cannabis, where it showed through the MRI scan and the imaging that it disrupts what they call the salient network, which is the bit of network in your brain that allows you to get motivated and do things. So it was clear. So the argument there, if or not, does it affect you or doesn't it, it was clear for everybody. You see, it does. So, we're talking about, should we legalise something that can have an impact on a person like that? And we know, again, through all the other reports, and again, I'm sure people put an argument against it, but all the other reports show links, particularly at early ages, sort of teenage, 12, 13, 14, 15, links to depression, mental health issues, all sorts of things. So, do we want to really be in a society where we're saying, let's go on, let's just legalise it, because it's a bit of a headache, let's just legalise it and let's get on with it.
All right, Dave, you made loads of points, so let Peter come back.
Yep.
Yes, an awful lot of points there. I think the first thing to say is that Dave may not be keen on facts and figures, but I mean, unless we look at facts and figures, then how else can we develop an intelligent policy? And we have to look at the evidence of what cannabis, what harms cannabis can cause, or what harms are around cannabis, and we have to look at the facts and figures. But the key thing I think to say about what Dave said is that the evidence of what's happened in other countries just does not support what he says. I understand his fears that introducing a regulated market for cannabis would increase use, but the evidence is that it doesn't. I mean, he mentions Amsterdam. The age at which people start using cannabis in Holland is significantantly higher than the age at which people start using cannabis in the UK. And the number of underage people who use cannabis in Holland is significantly lower.
Haven't the Dutch government in the past publicly said they regretted the move to decriminalise cannabis?
Well, I mean, without getting into too many details, there's a particular chap called Justice Minister called Opstelten, who has been trying to wage war against cannabis and reverse a number of the Dutch policies. Ironically, he just had to resign recently because of a corrupt relationship with a drug baron, which really tells you all you need to know about the murky area between law enforcement and drug dealing. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I mean, if you look in Colorado as well and Washington, where it's been legalized, the use by young people goes down. When you legally regulate something, you're never going to wipe out harms completely. As Dave says, children find it easier at the moment to buy cannabis than they do to buy alcohol. But they can buy alcohol because, as he says, they'll get someone older to go in and buy it for them. Well, I'm not saying that you'll wipe that out. You won't. You never eliminate all the harms. What you must aim to do is to minimise the harms. Okay, now, moving on to Dave's next point about some...
Dave, you can jump in at any time.
Yeah, I just one quick point. I don't want to interrupt Peter because he needs to have his fair shout at this. But just one point on the Amsterdam issue. Look, if we're going to look at anything, we learn through experiences, not only as human beings, but as a country and other things. There's Amsterdam that's had a very low tolerance, low sort of zero tolerance in respect of enforcing law for cannabis use. When they introduced the cannabis cafes in, I think it was 76, whereby you could go along and have your joint or your space cake and sit down and chat away and chill out and do whatever you need to do. That all sound lovely-dovely. It all sound great. There was no problems. There was no links with any issues. It was all... In fact, even I could say, even in my time as a copper, I've come across any...
Where they stopped them in Maastricht on the southern border, what you've had is a resurgence of street dealers, and dealers who were selling people cocaine and heroin as well.
Yeah.
Where cannabis is legally available to adults through coffee shops, the hard drug situation in Holland, heroin addiction is at a rate of 1/6 in Holland of what it is in the UK. And part of that is because they have legally regulated access to cannabis for adults.
Just to go back that note, or before Peter sort of came in there, going back to the cafes, if we wanted to learn anything, as I say, it's been going on to 76, that sort of approach, which I think really where Peter wants to be with this within the UK. They have passed the legislation, it has been passed, they tried to challenge it in the European Law Court, saying it was unfair what they were trying to bring in, but they have passed it, they've agreed. And the reason they wanted to introduce new legislation in Amsterdam was that because of the... it's all to do with the antisocial behaviour and other things that are going on, the influx of other drugs within the area, because they've operated on with a view that, let's go along and you're just saying black every shops where you can have your cannabis, but it's been causing massive issues. The government to take these extensive sort of actions to try and get it, or if you like, bring it back under control, it just shows you where we could go if we introduced that sort of thing in the UK.
No, that's not what's happening.
What would happen. And if you've ever been to Amsterdam recently, which I have been myself, not only do you get cannabis there, which has always been around, but every single corner you walk around, there's something. You want some Charlie, you want some Coke.
Well, I've been...
more and more drugs, and that's the reality beyond the streets of what would happen.
Right, Peter, I know you want to come back in, but I have to say, in Dave's defence, Amsterdam is one of the places Oh, hang on a sec. I pushed a button. Can you get Dave back? Because I've lost him. Amsterdam is one of the places I've visited in the world, and it's one of the few places I've actually been stopped in the street and offered heroin.
Have you really? Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that may be the case. I mean, I can't, but the fact is that, I mean, Dave talks about what's called the gateway theory and that it introduces those. That is simply not true. The rate of heroin addiction, as I just said, in Holland is 1/6 of what it is in the UK. And the reason Holland introduced what's called its Gedogen policy was because it wanted to separate soft drugs from hard drugs.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what it's achieved. And as I just explained, where the Wiet Pass, which was this insane idea that only Dutch residents could go to a coffee shop, was introduced in Maastricht on the southern border of Holland, what immediately happened was the dealers went back on the streets. And that's where the access to, that's where the gateway happens, where these dealers are operating outside the law and are also producing other substances as well. But let me move on, because Dave's covered an awful lot of points.
Yeah.
And you're not allowing me to come back on them all. On the issue of links to mental health, right? Now, cannabis is a psychoactive substance. So to suggest that it couldn't have any links to mental health would be ridiculous. But we do have to look at facts and figures. Okay, and if you look at the actual records, this is not evidence, this is facts. The actual facts of what have happened in British mental hospitals, okay, there are approximately 48,000 people admitted to a mental hospital each year for mental problems relating to alcohol use. Now, there are 10 times as many people use alcohol regularly as use cannabis. So you might expect there to be perhaps 1/10 as many people admitted for cannabis, but there aren't. There are only about 1,000 people admitted to hospital each year for mental problems relating to cannabis. So that means that you are approximately 4.8 or 5 times more likely to be admitted to hospital in the UK for mental health problems relating to alcohol than to cannabis.
Well, yeah, Peter, but I mean, in fairness, I know where to go and get a drink.
Yeah.
I don't know where to go and buy cannabis. Is Dave's point? Are you back, Dave?
Yeah, I'm back with you.
Is Dave's?
Well, you may not know where to buy cannabis, but most people do.
Well, to be honest, I don't, because my point is, while alcohol is readily available on almost every street corner, every supermarket, every pub, then problems with alcohol are bound to be higher. They're bound to be higher. Dave's point is, if cannabis is decriminalised, problems with cannabis will edge its way up to be as much a problem, if not more, than alcohol is now.
But the evidence doesn't show that, does it? I mean, I've just explained to you that it's the situation in Colorado. I've explained to you, anybody who wants cannabis in the UK can get it easily. Right? We consume 3.5 tons every day. We spend £6 billion a year on it, and all of that at the moment goes into the black market, into criminals' pockets. It funds organised crime. It funds other sorts of crime as well. What we need.
But Peter, if we decriminalise, Dave used to be a policeman. Dave, a question to both of you: if we decriminalise cannabis, do the drug dealers go away?
No, is the answer to that. They don't go away at all, because it's like anything. If you decriminalise cannabis or any other drug,
they'll sell something else.
There'll always be a market for dealers, because at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, when they fancy a joint or they fancy a hit of heroin and it's pouring down with rain, they're not going to go along to a cafe or any other licensed.
There's an illicit alcohol market as well, isn't there? I mean, I recognise that.
Yeah, but I mean, you keep going back to alcohol. Alcohol's within the system. You can't put alcohol, when you're talking about usage and the issues it would cause, in the same boat as you can with cannabis. I'm telling you from lots of years on the streets, Peter, so please do listen to what I'm saying. And I'm speaking on behalf of thousands and thousands of parents where the kids have been impacted through the use of cannabis, not only through the drug itself, that have been dragged into drug dealing networks to supply it, to deal it, and have ended up in a nightmare.
Okay.
So I'm speaking not only as a couple, but somebody's been involved in a lot of years in the education.
All right, Peter,
and it's
Dave,
seen firsthand the reality of the damage this drug can do. Let's get real about it.
Dave, let Peter speak.
I mean, that's because it's illegal. Most of the harms around cannabis are not caused by cannabis itself. They're caused by the criminal markets, and they're caused by the enforcement of the laws which Dave has pursued. That's what causes harm to people. There are
but Peter,
the most dangerous thing about cannabis is smoking it with tobacco. The second most dangerous thing about cannabis is getting a criminal conviction for it. Okay? And the idea that cannabis is more harmful than alcohol is frankly laughable. You know, Dave really needs to get put his specs on, get on the computer, and then find the overwhelming evidence. You know, the last study shows that, in fact, the figure was alcohol is 114 times more harmful than cannabis.
Right. Well, let me stop you both and let me ask you both a question, because my point is this, Peter. I take on board what you're telling me about what evidence has shown us, what experience has shown us. But what about the stuff it can't show us? For instance, if you've got, for argument's sake, 100 drug dealers and 50 of them are selling, you know, cannabis, and the rest of them are selling much harder drugs, then the 50 that are selling cannabis, would they not just immediately start selling the harder drugs? Would we not get a bigger problem with harder drugs? Any drug dealer that supplies cannabis right now is not going to just hang up his hat and give in purely and simply because it's decriminalised in some way and people have access to it.
It's a really bizarre question, Tom, isn't it? I mean, how can we base policy on what we don't know? You know, all we can do is look at the evidence of what has happened.
It's not a bizarre question, Peter, because once it's done, it's done.
Yeah, but
and once it's done, it's probably, as Holland has found, irreversible.
Well, Holland doesn't want to reverse it. Fact, to totally counter the point that Dave was making, all the mayors of the major cities in Holland are presently working on a way in which they can actually cultivate and produce cannabis themselves. You know, Opstelter, who was the disgraced justice minister who's now gone, was the only force against cannabis reform in Holland. He's gone. And in a year or two's time, Holland will follow exactly the same model that Colorado's followed. You know, we've now got Oregon and Alaska have also followed. There'll be another couple of states to legalize in the U.S. this year, more the year after that. You know, by the time we get to the next presidential inauguration in 2017, there will probably be at least a dozen states in America.
Isn't the situation in the States where you literally need a license to use it?
No. In the 4 states I've just mentioned, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska, they've introduced a fully legally regulated system for adults. In 34 states in America, you can have access to medical marijuana, as they call it. Yeah. And in those states as well, teenage use has gone down since legal access to medical marijuana was made available. The facts and evidence are overwhelming. You know, Dave, there are policemen who've seen the light. There's a lot of policemen.
Let me ask Dave. Dave, I asked a question. Peter called it a bizarre question. The question was quite simply, what do the drug dealers who sell cannabis do the day after decriminalisation?
They'd still sell cannabis. They'd still sell it, because all youngsters, if you decriminalise cannabis, I guess they'll go along the lines of what I think Peter mentioned last week about possibly being over 18, going to a licensed premises and buying it there. What about all the kids, the 11, the 12, the 13, the 14-year-olds?
It's going to become...
That leaves it wide open for the dealers to bring them in, because the kids are going to think, well, I can't go, I'm not old enough, I'm going to get ID, I'll just go back to a dealer.
The system you support at the moment, Dave, puts cannabis in the hands of 12-year-olds. It's because you advocate the policies you do and the enforcement of those laws that 12-year-olds have access to cannabis. It's because you've abandoned all control and given it to criminals. Instead of taking responsibility for the issue and saying we want to protect our children, we want to protect our communities, you say, no, we're just going to pretend it doesn't exist and let it get on.
Surely, Peter, you cannot really seriously be trying to tell me or any other listener to this programme that you want 12-year-olds to have access to cannabis. Listen, I've been on the street. I've worked with numerous families. I've been involved. I was involved. Just a quick story with a charity called Marcus and Luke Trust based in York. 2 families, Margaret and Susan, mothers, would tell you, and this is the reality of cannabis use, never mind the facts and figures, they would tell you their kids got access to cannabis through local dealers. And there's lots of reasons youngsters want to try drugs, curiosity, peer pressure, lots of things we could talk about. The fact of the matter is, they got onto it. The parents were a little bit slow to pick up on it, and it developed so much so it led on to other drugs. And I just wanted to pick up on Peter's point when he mentioned about the no links to gateway drug. Well, I'm sorry, Peter, you've got it wrong, mate. Every single person, listen, Peter, just quickly, every single person, I'm going back to my cop days now, that I've interviewed and locked up, I'm not talking about users, dealers as well, dealers that are dealing drugs to feed their own habits, I would say 95% plus, probably even higher, when I've sat there and said, how did you end up in this sorry state with these addictive drugs you're on, such as heroin, crack and other things, 95%, possibly even more, would say it all started dabbling with a bit of cannabis. And you're really trying to say, now let's just...
Right, let Peter answer.
Say black is white, and none of the evidence supports it. The gateway drug is alcohol or tobacco. It's well established, well proven by reputable scientists throughout the world. You don't like facts and figures because they don't support your argument.
Peter, the gateway drug isn't alcohol, cigarettes. There's people that smoke cigarettes and have taken alcohol and never used cannabis.
Gentlemen.
What about young people? If you're introducing or allowing young people access to cannabis, without a shadow of a doubt, 100%, you will put them at risk, not only of developing a habit on the cannabis, but going on...
Dave, hang on.
...to experiment with other drugs.
Easy policies that you support.
Okay.
Because you've abandoned our young people to criminals. You know, you need to take responsibility for the markets. Stop pretending that you can deal with it by slapping people in jail or prosecuting people.
Peter, we haven't abandoned them. That's why we're going through thorough education programs. Where does it in the life book, the skills of life, does it say you have to have a life using cannabis? It's a percentage, a small percentage that do. Let's keep educating and give them the facts and let them make the decision.
Dave,
your facts and let them have it. They're myths.
Right.
The information you're giving people is mythology. It has no basis in evidence or fact.
You know it isn't, Peter. Peter, deep down, you know that's a complete utter rubbish.
Gentlemen, I've
offered you the evidence, Dave, and you don't like facts and figures.
All right, well, okay, yeah.
Dave, Peter, I've got to leave it there, but thank you for debating.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cheers, bye-bye.
Cheers,
bye-bye.
Bye. So there you go. My question, quite simply, have you changed your mind on what cannabis is and how we should be controlling it, or should we be locking people up for it? Should we be decriminalising it? You had Peter with a lot of facts and figures, and of course you had Dave, who has pounded the beat. He's been a policeman, and he's spent most of his working life with the drug squad locking people up for it. Which side of the fence did you fall on when listening to that?